How's it going? Welcome to another episode of Peak Performer. I'm Larry McGuire, working business psychologist, and this podcast is all about helping you understand the mental skills, the psychological skills to improve your performance, do a better job in your work, in your sport, in your career, in your education, and so forth. The principles are the same, and what we try and do here is break these down in a way that perhaps you can understand them a little bit better and apply these skills and so forth to your own work and sport, etc. So today I'm joined by Dr. Dylan Colbert. Dylan, how's it going? Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having
Could
me,
you
Larry.
tell everybody a little bit about you, your background, what you do, who you're engaged with, and so forth?
My name is Dr. Dylan Colbert. Originally, my research interests were in behavior analysis, the study of intelligence. I did my master's and my PhD at Maynooth University with the intention of developing new assessments and new intervention strategies for intelligence to improve intellectual skills and academic performance. That was the early part of my career post graduation. And over time, that slowly morphed into looking at performance in a wider perspective. I suppose what really attracted me to intelligence was the advantages it gave individuals in terms of occupational success, academic success, and all these other areas. But gradually, I suppose I became interested in peak performance, elite performers, and trying to decode the ingredients that made the difference between them and number two. So in the last few years, I've moved into the area of sport and performance psychology, really with the intention of trying to understand the psychological, emotional, motivational variables that can help people elevate their level of performance to reach their goals. I work with teams, I work with individuals, I work with business people, I work with kids, I work with people at late stages of career. So across the spectrum, I just try to help people improve their level of performance and overcome challenges for them reaching their goals.
And there are certain commonalities, aren't there, in terms of how we prepare, how we deal with challenges, how we process those challenges, and so forth, regardless
Mm.
of whether you're in business for yourself, you're working on a career, whether you're only starting out in education, or you're in sport at elite level, or maybe not so elite level. There are common features, aren't there? The common elements that we should work on.
100%. And that's one of the things that really struck me when I kind of migrated into this field maybe 5 years ago. That if you look at an elite sports person and you look at those essential variables that they have, the tools, the characteristic, the competencies that they have, and that may explain their success, there's 100% shared core competencies between those and elite business people, elite artistic performers, elite
Mhm,
academics.
mhm.
And so a lot of the time, what I really see is it doesn't really matter what context one of my clients is operating within, because there are core ingredients that are going to be advantageous no matter what you're trying to achieve. Really, there'll be
Yeah.
context specifics too,
Mhm.
but there is a toolkit, a skill set that is going to be beneficial no matter what you're trying to achieve.
A skill set. That's a great way of putting it. And one of those skills, you might say, is broadly speaking, I suppose, managing oneself, understanding one's emotions, being able to process all of that. And today we wanted to talk about anxiety
Mm,
and what it is, maybe demystify it, remove some of the misconceptions, talk about some of the causes of anxiety, um, misconceptions, as I said, what we can do before, during, and after our particular performance event, and so forth.
mm.
So, if we could get the ball rolling on this topic, can you tell us a little bit about anxiety? What do we understand it to be? When someone says I'm anxious or I'm feeling anxiety, what are they talking about?
So typically, when we're talking about anxiety, we're referring to an unpleasant emotional state that is characterized by feelings of worry, pessimism, physical tension in some cases, usually triggered by the anticipation of a future event or scenario.
Mm,
I think the key word there is anticipation in a lot of cases. It is future oriented
okay.
and it is concern
Mm,
and doubt and worry. about something that may or may not happen. And in terms of talking about demystifying it, I think that's an important point to make.
Okay.
Because one of the first places I tend to start with an individual who experiences this anxiety is to very, very clearly underline the fact that this emotional state, while it's real and it's valid and it's important, is being spurred on by something that may or may not happen.
Okay,
Um,
so we're imagining ourselves in a future scenario, and there's
yeah.
an emotion attached to that. Is that what we're talking about?
100%. There's emotion attached to it. There's physiological symptoms attached to it. There's thinking styles and cognitive biases attached to it as well. So it is very multifaceted. Some people will experience great levels of intensity in terms of the physiological symptoms, but maybe not the cognitive symptoms, or vice versa. And so there's a kind of broad spectrum of experiences of anxiety. But I suppose if I was trying to pin it down and give you a textbook
Mm.
definition, that's probably what I would say.
So if you were to think about, let's say, I know you work with a lot of teams and individuals in let's say GAA, for example.
Yeah.
So what are the some of the common descriptions or ways that anxiety manifests for those sports people? So for those listeners who are not familiar with GAA, it's an amateur sport in Ireland, played at a particular high level at, amongst counties, but within clubs, it's all amateur, volunteer based sport,
Yeah.
and it's very much a part of the community, and people love to be involved. But it is a highly competitive sport, and we love the game. And so,
Mm.
when you're working with people involved in the game, what are they saying to you? How does it arise? How do they describe it?
Well, again, players will report slightly different things, but generally speaking, I think they can kind of fit into one of three camps or some sort of combination of those camps. Some individuals deeply experience the mental cognitive manifestation of anxiety. So, a thought of doubt or worry or some concern about an ability to cope or perform in the future sets off a chain of motion of pessimistic thoughts, of
Mm.
negative thinking, of catastrophizing. And it goes from missing a pass to getting kicked off the team to not having your career to your wife leaving you. You know, we spiral very
Okay,
quickly
I
there,
shouldn't laugh, but because I know it's serious for a lot of people. Yeah.
100%. But it
Mm.
does, when you're outside of it, it can sound ridiculous at
Mm.
times. But when
Mm.
you're in the middle of it, there's a logical progression for those points. And sometimes
Mm.
you have to kind of have a look at those links in the chain and see if they're as
Mm.
strong as the individual client is feels that they are. So that's one element. The thought process can go awry, and the
Mm.
inside of somebody's head can be a dark, difficult place to
You
inhabit.
said it. You said it.
And
Mm.
so that can be one. And another thing that we see very commonly, and I particularly see this more often with male than female athletes, and I think there's elements of stigma that people are aware of that may explain this. And they may not report pessimistic thoughts, doubtful thoughts. They may not report a busy, internal mental experience at all, but
Mm.
they may report certain physical symptoms. Now, there's some symptoms that are more clearly, I suppose, linked to a state of anxiety. Like we talk about sweaty palms or nauseous stomach or tightness in your chest, difficulty breathing. Sometimes they report that. Other times they may report physical symptoms that can be linked to the experience of anxiety, but are maybe less obvious manifestations. So they may say things like, I'm doing my warm up, but I feel sluggish. I feel lethargic. I slept well. I ate well. I recovered well, but
Mm.
the energy's not there. I just can't wake up. I can't get in the zone. And you can see that. You can see accelerated fatigue. So they're burning out at half time when they should have 60, 80, 90 minutes in the legs. They can't explain it. And then the last category, which is probably the one that's least well known amongst my clients, is sometimes individuals may not report those two other camps, but they may report difficulties with concentration, locking in, getting in the zone. They may
Mm.
say things to me like, just don't know where my head was at. I was a bit distracted. I was a bit flighty. I wasn't really present.
Mm.
And concentration disruption can also be a manifestation of
Mm.
anxiety. So usually the clients will report a few of those shades of gray in between or tick a few of those boxes. So it is varied.
Mm. Interesting, because I was working with a guy recently, um, intercounty GA player at
Mm,
not at senior level, under 21s or 23s or whatever it was, who
Yeah.
reported that very thing. Who I asked him about, what he was thinking, what he was feeling, how this was coming about, why he was sitting in front of me, what brought him to come to that consultation. And I asked him, what are the nature of his thoughts? Where is his mind taken? He said, "Well, I'm not actually overthinking. I don't find myself
Yeah.
overthinking, but I
Yeah.
just have this feeling of being off, and it's been
Yeah.
around for a long time. And my girlfriend's asking me, what's wrong, you know."
Yeah.
And so he couldn't
Yeah.
unpack it. Is that
Yeah.
common?
100%. And I think that's why like psychoeducation is such an important part of working with clients, helping them become, I suppose, literate in understanding what's going on. Now, we don't want to navel gaze too much because that brings along its own problems, but we want to give them an ability to connect with the feeling, to try to label it and describe it, if possible, explain it, because it gives us a route in, gives them a route into understanding things, and usually it gives us a pathway out of that problem too. But definitely, particularly again, not to gender things too much, but I see that more commonly with male athletes. And
Mm,
sometimes it can be difficult to extrapolate whether are they uncomfortable sharing what is
okay.
going on,
Mm,
or are they not really connected to what's going on?
mm,
Because sometimes you can get the same reporting from
right.
those two different categories, you know?
Yeah, because sport is a very masculine. It's a very kind of expressive and
Mm,
aggressive, uh, um, aggressive in a good way most of the time. But often I think men build up this idea of themselves that they have to be macho and they have to be strong and they have to be this, that, and the other. Some
yeah.
would say that males are becoming more in touch with themselves, but I think we still have a way to go there, don't we?
We're playing catch up, I think,
Mm,
in a lot of ways. And I definitely even see that with my clients. Typically, my female clients are more literate and understanding and connected to their emotional experience, more open discussing it
mm,
than my male athletes or clients are. And sometimes I actually find that I have to be quite careful about the language that I use specifically surrounding the word anxiety, because almost there's a reaction if
mm.
I was to propose or ask a question surrounding, would you characterize your experience as potentially anxious? Not to suggest too much, but very often I kind of see a bit of a facial expression as
Okay.
if that was insulting,
Or I'd
insulting to
rather
their
not admit this,
masculinity or
that label or how I understand it to be, that's not me. And
mm,
so maybe it reinforces the problem we have with processing our feelings because we've got this notion of what anxiety is or isn't.
100%. So like some of the clients are more comfortable saying they're stressed than anxious. And I'm not going to split hairs on that terminology if it doesn't get in the way of their re not recovery but overcoming this obstacle. And if that's the word they're comfortable with, we can go with that. Sometimes with a nod and a wink that we both know what we're talking about truly
Okay.
here.
Mm,
But as long as we can still work in the
mm.
together and move in a forward direction, I'm not going to sweat that small stuff.
Yeah, so that's sport, but it also plays out in the workplace, doesn't it? Maybe there's a difficult work environment, or maybe there's an individual we're not getting on well with, or maybe
Mm,
there's a big event that we have to present, or
yeah.
whatever it happens to be, and it's coming up, it's in the future, and we have
Mm,
some thoughts around that. You mentioned that we catastrophize.
yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that phenomenon. What is this? What does it mean that we catastrophize? What's that about?
So basically, if we're talking about catastrophizing, we could talk about an individual, as you said, who's slightly anxious about an anticipated future event. And catastrophizing is the process whereby our thoughts, our expectations, our beliefs become increasingly more dramatic and
Mm,
increasingly pessimistic or negative as time goes on. So, like
mm,
the example, I'm going to miss a pass and then my wife is going to leave me.
yeah.
We can often see there's a build-up over time of
Mhm.
people are building these imagined realities that don't necessarily reflect true reality. And they're deeply distressing, and they're deeply bleak and pessimistic very often.
So I've a sales presentation to make. It's in front of
Yeah,
the board. I need to be on my game. And even though I've
yeah,
done this before, there's a seed of doubt about my ability. And so
yeah,
this begins to snowball. with the weeks and days in the run up to the event, almost to the point where the day before I'm about to deliver this presentation, I'm going to lose my job if I don't deliver on this, if I don't get this over the line. And
Exactly.
it can be somewhat unreasonable. We've taken
Mm.
ourselves to a very, dark place along that way, right?
100%. And it's as I said, very distressing. And I think a key component of it very often is this cognitive bias of mind reading that we're all
Mm,
guilty of. That
mm,
we think, first off, spotlight effect, we think people pay more attention to us and
mm,
specifically our mistakes than they
mm,
truly do. But then also that mind reading element that we think we have some sort of privilege, access, and insight into how everybody else thinks about us.
mm.
So I flub a word on my second slide, there's a typo on my fourth slide, and all of a sudden the line manager is never going to give me a promotion, even if I
A
work for another
disaster.
20
Yeah,
minutes. It's
I had that
disaster.
recently. I had that recently with a coaching client who was undergoing an exam, pretty important exam in their pursuit in their medical career,
Mm,
and it was a practical exam, and they had examiners in front of them, and they have to. There's maybe 15 examiners in the room, and the master's students will go in and they're questioned on particular aspects of their profession, and they have to be able to
mm,
respond as if they would in a real life scenario. And
yeah.
this particular client had convinced themselves that they had failed, and they had,
Mm,
and we were talking about it and maybe ways and means to process this and maybe think a little bit better about it, because isn't it true that regardless of whether we're reflecting on an event or we're projecting into a future event, it's how we feel now that's most important, isn't it? It's like,
yeah.
how am I processing this thought about myself and how I performed or how I will perform, and I'm
Mm,
doing it now, and what I feel now is most important because now is all I have.
yeah.
This is it. And when I get
Yeah.
to tomorrow, it'll still be now. And so how I
Yeah.
feel
Yeah.
is really important, right?
100%. So, and a lot of that catastrophizing and anxiety, broadly speaking, just drags people away from the present, from
Mm,
being present and really exerting the influence and control they can over the present moment to ensure the most positive outcome. So it undermines their ability to perform.
mm,
It almost becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy because if you're distracted by these negative thoughts because you're feeling anxious,
mm,
you're not locked in and in the game, and then maybe you do underperform. You prove yourself correct that you're not up to it, or you're not capable, or this is too big a step up, or you are rubbish at public speaking,
mm,
whatever it is. So we have to get people out of this cycle, exactly as you said, get them connected to the moment, because
mm.
that's the only moment you can win, so to speak.
Good way of putting it. I like it. Incidentally, that client emailed me a couple of days later and said, I passed. So
Yeah, yeah,
they're flying. So all of their catastrophizing, imagining themselves in a negative future, thinking about yesterday and saying that was a disaster. That was all irrational, completely irrational, disconnected
yeah,
from the truth of the matter, the
yeah.
subsequent truth, which was they passed.
There you
So I
go.
think it's to be kind to oneself, isn't it? A little bit to something I use when I'm chatting to people often is treat yourself as you would a best friend if they were in a similar situation to you.
100%. And that I say exactly the same thing to so many of my clients when that self-talk can be problematic for them. That first off, you open it up by saying the things that you would say to yourself, you would not dream of saying to another person.
Mm,
And sometimes I use the example of if you were trying to coach a little kid in your activity or somebody fresh out of college, if it's a business context, if you were trying to give them feedback on their performance, would you color it this way? Would you be that critical? Would you be that direct and personal, whatever it is? And
mm,
they'd say, not in a million years. And you ask them why, and they say, that person might crumble, that will discourage them, they'll disengage, and it won't help them get better. And
mm,
sometimes then the penny starts to drop that, oh, it's not helpful, it's not useful,
mm,
I'm not doing myself a service here.
mm,
And one thing I definitely find that we have to kind of separate is that um, kind of allegiance, that devout allegiance and commitment to self-criticism that is often a part of high performance. You need to be able to evaluate your
mm,
performance and you need to be very honest and objective, being able to separate that process from its emotional baggage
mm,
and being able to isolate that process for what it's worth, take the good and minimize the bad of it. That's
mm,
something I very often see with the highest of my performers very often. And I think we're going in the wrong direction if we try to stop people from engaging in that critical evaluation.
Good
I think the
point.
key thing is, I think there's a healthy way of doing it. But if I, as a psychologist, tell somebody who's performed very well and a key driver of their success has been, I go through my performance with a fine tooth comb, and
Mm,
I do not allow myself to take it easy on myself in terms of that appraisal. If I tell them to get rid of that, they'll get rid of me because I clearly
mm,
don't understand what has been good in terms of their psychological makeup.
mm.
But there's a way of managing it. You can do
Yeah,
it
so let's
healthily.
let's dig into that a little, because I think that's a really important distinction. It's, and you mentioned the word evaluation. To
Mm,
evaluate is sometimes used or not. We sometimes use criticism as a misplaced term for evaluation, and
yeah.
evaluation is qualitatively different, isn't it? It's almost like, here's what happened, and there's the negative emotion is not attached to it. It's like you can see the
Mm,
fact of the performance for what it is. Okay, it's
yeah.
almost an acceptance of what is. Here's
Yeah.
how it played out, and here's how I'd like it to go better next time. So let's talk about that, the difference between self criticism and self evaluation.
Well, I suppose if we look at self-evaluation, it is less emotional in tone. It can have critical elements because there may have been mistakes or underperformances. And I think for a lot of people, when we talk about self-criticism, it undermines or overlooks the positives of performance. It
Mm,
hones in on the negatives of performance, and it beats you over the head with the
good
negative
point. Yeah,
implications
it
of
does
that
beat you up.
performance.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the problem. And I think kind of you were alluding to it there. Sometimes that's a badge of honor for athletes, that they do go the route of, no, I don't let anything get by. I don't take it easy on myself. I let myself know if I've underperformed because I feel that that's a necessary ingredient in motivating my progression, my development. Um, and I think, again, as you spoke about there, the key point is find the value in the evaluation. And once that evaluation and that value has been provided, well, then you move on to the next step. It's dwelling on the mistakes that is really
Mm,
what the problem is.
mm,
So one of the things I always do with my clients is I again emphasize the value they found in that evaluation is that it identifies what needs to be improved. It identifies where we need to go.
mm,
But once we have then committed to a course of action to address that underperformance or that failure, if you wanted to use that word, the evaluation process has served its function for that time. Let's keep moving forward. Let's focus on what we can do to avoid this underperformance going forward. When we perform, we'll evaluate again, but there needs to be a full stop and a closed door on that evaluation once we commit to an action to improve.
mm. I think that's a key way of looking at the whole term evaluation, is the extraction of value from what we've from the performance, from what we've done when we're reflecting
Yeah,
on our work or
yeah,
sport. We've already kind of touched on this a little bit, but maybe we can talk a little bit more about what we can do about it,
mm,
do about anxiety. Actually, before that, you mentioned stress.
yeah,
So why is stress important? Some people maybe believe and mistakenly believe that stress is bad, or all
mm.
stress is good, or maybe you're one side or the other. Let's talk a little bit about that. So what does psychology understand about stress and its importance, and maybe where it starts to negatively impact performance?
Yeah, very good point because I do think that when we look at stress within a psychological framework and from our discipline, we do wield that term slightly differently and we use it to refer to something different. So typically, when a psychologist is talking about stress, it's anchored in the physiological, neurological experience of stress. People will be well versed when it comes to the idea of the fight or flight response. Really what we would call that is a stress response. So a variety of contexts will produce that stress response, and the function of that stress response is, evolutionary speaking, to keep you alive.
Mm,
And one of the issues that we find currently with chronic stress, I suppose, is the fact that our system, our nervous system, has evolved in a very different context with very different stressors and has not been updated to deal with the modern stresses of your work presentation, paying your mortgage, whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
So it's an outdated system. It works really well if you're trying to get away
Mm-hmm.
from a bear.
Mm-hmm.
It does not work really well if you're worried about paying your mortgage.
Mm-hmm.
And then that leads to this chronic state where it's there forever.
Yeah.
And again, closely related to anxiety, but I suppose when we look at then more varied emotional experience, that is derived from an appraisal and labeling very often of that physiological experience. We evaluate the context and then we understand it. So, like the example I tend to use is if you're a 6 year old and it's the 24th of December and you're lying in your bed and your heart is pumping out your chest, you
Mm-hmm.
can understand that as excitement because of the
Mm-hmm.
context. It's Christmas Eve. I'm going to get presents tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're standing in front of a group of colleagues and you're about to do your presentation and your heart is pumping out of your chest and you're worried about your performance, we could then appraise that and label it as anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
So there's not so many different shades of physiological emotion, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Very often it's that physiological experience of stress plus contextual cues
Yes, the
that will help us
environment.
color
Yes,
it.
yes, yes.
Yeah, it helps us understand what it is
Mm.
that we're feeling. But
Yeah.
sometimes we can get that one wrong too.
Before a game, I'm nervous. Maybe it's okay to be nervous or right and proper to be nervous before a
Mm,
game. So
yeah,
how do I interpret that? Does this mean that I'm not ready, or does it mean
yeah,
that this signal tells me I am ready? And often
yeah.
we can get that wrong.
Exactly, and that I care. Like that's the
Yes.
key thing. The outcome
Mm,
is important to you. Your performance is important to you. And as long as you can harness that and use it as motivation, and that intensity of emotion doesn't tip over the edge, well,
mhm,
then you're in a good position. There could be helpful negative emotions, and there can be unhelpful positive emotions. And I think that's also an important point to make. Like, we don't want a performer feeling like, the height of arrogance before performance, even if that's well
absolutely.
grounded, because
Mm,
they're going to get complacent, you
mhm,
know. And at the same time, negative emotion can be conducive to performance. A little bit of nerves, people are well aware, can be useful. A little bit of irritation or even frustration, if harnessed correctly, can be useful. Even anger can be useful if harnessed effectively.
mhm,
We just have to be careful about whether we tap into it and use it, making sure we can regulate it.
mm,
But negative emotions aren't necessarily all bad. Going back to the point on
yes.
stress, even,
Mm,
stress can be useful.
yeah, good point. So, getting on to some practical aspects, what can we do in your experience before, during, and after an anxious event or a feeling of, let's call it, negative emotion? We're not in a good place. We've an event coming up, whether
Yeah.
it's a game, whether it's a presentation in work, whether it's a whatever it happens to be, event coming up. We're a little bit apprehensive about this event. What can we do in the run up to it to be better prepared and to manage ourselves? Give us something on that.
Yeah, so well, I suppose I will present slightly different interventions for slightly different people, but there are general kind of approaches that you can take that will usually benefit most people. And usually if I'm working with a client in a scenario like this, I kind of work backwards. So I try to give them the most fast acting, immediate, acute interventions for in the moment, stress or anxiety. So like
Hmm.
right before they start the presentation, right
Okay, so
before
we're
the
ready to
worst case
go. We're
scenario goes.
on the line. The bell is about to ring,
Yeah.
and we're all uptight about it.
So at that point, usually what I will do is kind of prioritizing different elements of that anxious state. I usually try to help them regulate the physiological experience of stress or anxiety, because unless that is mitigated and under control, the more complex cognitive strategies are maybe difficult to get to and work on. And so typically I would recommend a few different fast acting, quick, easy to remember strategies. So, like on my LinkedIn, I've put up videos on this before on my Instagram. Progressive muscle relaxation is one that can work really, really well if you're in that camp of physical manifestation of anxiety. Um, Very, very simple. Do you want me to go through it? Will I
Yeah,
give you a
let's do
quick?
that. Yeah, let's kind of dig into the terminology and give the kind of layperson's understanding of what that is.
Okay, cool. So, progressive muscle relaxation is actually one of the oldest sports psychology techniques that are out there. It's around for about 100 years. Um, you can use it in a long form or a short form. In this context, I'd recommend the short form. Super easy to remember, and I think that's important because if your head is spinning a little
Mm,
bit, you need something that you grab hold of quick. You don't want an instruction manual.
Yeah.
So typically the way it works is you're going to isolate a muscle group. For this fast acting response, I would say your fists or even your toes. What you're going to do is you're going to tense as tight as you can without hurting yourself, your fists. And you're going to do that for 5 seconds typically. And what's really important, you need to direct your attention to that feeling of tension within your hand. If you don't connect to it, it's not going to really work quite as well. You're going to focus on that for 5 seconds, then you're going to release for 10 seconds, again, placing attention on that contrasting feeling.
Mm.
And again, in layman's terms, what that is kind of going to do is release some pent up tension. Now, if you do that a few times, or if you even work through more muscle groups, go through the arm, go through your core, do it with your legs, whatever it is, what you will see is it will take the edge off. Okay. So, and that's what we're trying to do in acute moments. We're not going to solve anxiety at that time, but we're just trying to give somebody composure and control by dropping that level of intensity.
Take
Just
our
a bit of
mind
breathing
off
space.
the perceived problem.
Exactly. Just so you can think a little bit more clearly. That's exactly what you want. You want that clarity. So you just want to drop that level. And I like to pair it just with a simple breathing technique of deep inhale through the nose with the tension.
Breathe, yeah.
And pause for maybe 2 seconds at the top of it. And then a long, slow, controlled exhale through the mouth with the release. If somebody does that 2 or 3 times, it just drops that level enough where they can kind of go, all right, I think I'm all right. I think I have this. Because one of the things you'll see is if performance anxiety goes through the roof, self-belief tends to go down. And that's not what we want. We don't want that doubt there. But if people feel that they have a tool that works, and if the tool works, you see that they have that extra bit of confidence, they can probably get stuck in and do a good job. Does that make sense?
Yes, very much so.
That's one. And then another one, very simple, has been called the physiological sigh or the psychological sigh. I nicked this one from Andrew Huberman, who has done a good bit of research on it lately.
Yeah, I like this actually. I've read a bit about this one, all right, yeah.
It's cool. And to be honest with you, like I was skeptical that this would work. I was listening to a podcast in the car and I thought, that doesn't sound right to me. But the more I've looked into it, I was like, oh, there actually is a theoretical basis for this. There's empirical data supporting it. And my clients will tell me it works. Real simple. Again, breathing technique. You can do it anywhere, easy to use. And big, deep inhale slowly through the nose until you're fit to burst. So as much as you can, hold it just for a second or two, and then a sharp inhale through the nose like this. And then exhale, slowly relax the facial muscles. Now, I wasn't stressed before, but I feel much better already,
Very good.
2 or 3 of those, 2 or 3 of those, and honestly, just takes the edge off enough to give you that composure back.
Okay.
And that's typically what I like to do. Those physiological measures, one might work better than the other for somebody. We might have to tweak it, but it's a good start,
Yeah, you're really asking people to get present, aren't you? Get
Well,
out of here
too.
and get into here get into your body a little bit more.
It gives them that anchoring sense as well, so we're not spiraling out here. We're connected to something very simple, and even just that kind of awareness of the mechanism and the procedure just kind of gives you a bit of laser focus on the here and now. Deep breath, you can get stuck in, that might work.
Excellent.
So that can work.
People can use that when we're right on the line, ready to start, the heat of the moment, or even in advance, right? In the days or weeks in the run up to it.
Exactly. So like in the heat of the moment, you can do it. For a sports person, I say just to maintain that level of relaxation, if there's a break in play and you have a minute, just do 1 or 2 of those sighs, or do the progressive muscle relaxation, And with the progressive muscle relaxation, it can also be very useful to do the long form in the lead up. And the way I tend to explain it is, what we don't want is for your stress levels to get to that threshold of overwhelm of Jesus, I can't do this, I'm in trouble here. So one of the ways that you can mitigate that situation is by just reducing that baseline level of stress as much as possible in the lead up. Because if you're just below the line, that situation of standing up in front of the group tips you over the edge. But if you can drop that line in the lead up, it just means you can kind of take a few hits and still maintain composure,
You have a bit more space,
So the long form, I would typically say the morning of, the night before, a few days leading up, even as a daily practice,
Mm.
go through the full body with progressive muscle relaxation. And it's kind of similar to a body scan in yoga, if maybe some of the
Yes.
listeners would be,
Mm.
it shares
Mm.
aspects. And then I'd be a big fan of recommending meditation if I can win people over to it. It can be a
Mm.
hard sell sometimes with
Yeah,
the
absolutely.
macho players.
Mm.
It can be a hard sell, but the real value of that is not necessarily for me in its relaxing properties, but in its ability to improve your attentional control.
Mm.
So that'll build a general capability of not being swept away by negative thoughts, by allowing the thought to come in and allowing the thought to go without it grabbing hold of your
Yeah,
world.
without becoming
Um,
attached to it or identifying with the negativity or the negative thought that just breezed across your mind. It's
exactly. Let it come, let it pass.
mm. um, and that's an important. I use meditation as well. I'm a
Yeah,
firm advocate of it. I
yeah,
don't do it every day, but I often find that when I build momentum with it, I can
yeah.
take some of that into my everyday life, and I'm managing the stresses of everyday life and work a little bit better than I might otherwise. Now, maybe that's my own kind of biased interpretation, but that's what I feel, and if that's what I feel, and that's what most important for the individual, right?
Look, 100%. 100%. And like, I don't know how long like you would typically do what, like, I think people have the
15
expectation,
minutes.
50, which is, that is a long time. And like, and brilliant. I tend to just say to my athletes, like, do 2 minutes. If you can do
Mm,
2 minutes 2 or 3 times a week, first off, it'll get your foot in the door and you might be able to see some of the benefits, which may convert you. So that's
mm,
a beneficial thing.
mm,
And, but as well as that, if you've never done it before, 2 minutes can give you an awful lot of clarity, exactly as you were
mm,
saying.
mm. Excellent. So, after the event, we're looking at our performance, we're looking at the team, maybe it's a work context, maybe it's a sports context, where
Yeah,
maybe things didn't go too well. How do we
yeah.
deal with that? What's the best way to process the event that didn't go according to plan?
First off, what I would say is if you can, give yourself a little bit of space from it, detach from it if possible. And that can be difficult for some people. You don't necessarily have to do that. But what I would always direct somebody towards is, okay, you are going to evaluate your performance. You're going to be critical of your performance. Whatever it is, that is going to happen. uh, let's see if we can do that in a way that is healthy for you, isn't distressing for you, but still gives you the benefits of that evaluation. Um, so usually I use a fairly structured technique. Again, I think I've put this up on my Instagram recently. It's a technique that really builds resilience, but it can be very beneficial just for being able to take the good out of that learning experience. I call it the 4 C's of resilience. Um, and what I try to do with this technique is I provide a specific structure which encourages the individual to be balanced in their appraisal and also points them in the direction of what needs to be done to improve upon the thing that's being regretted or people are worried about. So I asked them very simply, okay, we're going to have 4 C's. First C is commend. So write down 3 things that went well, 3 things you were happy with, whatever they were.
Mm.
Doesn't matter if they're big, small, but write down three. We need three. And the second C is then continue. So, okay, what do you need to do now going forward to replicate those wins, so to speak? So you're going to keep on doing the right things to replicate that success. The third C, and I'm testing my own memory here, doing off by rote, is
No, no bother.
critique.
Okay.
Is critique. And no, I could remember it there. I wasn't stalling, so
Which
it come
order?
back. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I did have it. That made it
Feel
sound
the
like I was
pressure
stalling, but no,
rising
I had
now.
it.
Got to use the
That's
old
it. I'm panic. Yeah.
breathe deeply.
Yeah. And third critique. So, okay, what didn't go well? Write 3 of them, don't write 4 of them. Don't write 10 of them. Write 3 of them. Highlight the
Mhm.
3 that are most important. And then the fourth C is commit. Okay, so these are the things you weren't happy with.
I like it.
What 3 things now are you going to do to address it? Like, that's not rocket science. It's not complex. It's simple, but it's easy, but it gives them balance and it gives them a kind of roadmap, if that makes sense,
Mm.
and to address those problems. And that's what you want your evaluation to do. Show you highlight what you've done well,
Hmm.
and highlight what you need to continue doing, and then also show you what needs to improve and how to improve upon it.
So give us those four again. We've got command,
commend, so what you did well,
Yeah.
continue, what you're going to
Yeah.
continue to do to repeat those. Number
Critique.
3 is critique, what
Yeah.
didn't go well, what you weren't
Hmm.
happy with, and then commit, what you're going to change in order to address those shortcomings, if we want to
Yeah.
call
I'm
them that.
hearing parallels here with, you know, Stephen C. Hayes' acceptance and commitment therapy in cognitive
Yeah,
behavioral, the cognitive behavioral field. I'm hearing Martin
100%.
Seligman,
Yeah.
and write down every night. Write down your journal. 3 things that went well today. Positive psychology. You can see how these things, these ideas overlap and bleed into all areas of life. We're not talking about work alone here. We're not talking about sport or education. All of it. It matters and it's relevant.
100%. 100%. And you're dead right, because typically what tends to happen is I come across an issue or a problem and I try to figure out a solution. I have a few ideas for how to do that. Then I look at the literature, and usually like ACT has done it better than I am doing it. So like I just adopt some of their approaches. So
Mm,
acceptance commitment therapy and CBT, there's a lot of great stuff in there that
mm,
you can use in a tap to any context,
yeah.
so you're dead right. Seligman too, his stuff on virtues and character as
Mm,
well can be
character strengths.
guiding
Yeah.
lights. Yeah.
Yeah, all of this stuff is really important to understand. And I think the key is, you mentioned at the top, psychoeducation, bringing this
Mm,
information to people, but not to take it away from the kind of uh, overhyped, almost pseudoscience which has occurred or developed around these concepts and ideas that have been developed through decades and decades of research and practice in human
mm,
behavior, personality, performance, and so on, and actually get to the root, to go to the root of and the origin of the idea, rather than
mm.
playfully on the surface and not really understand the how these ideas were developed. And that's the key, isn't it, when we're working with people?
Like 100%, and you hit the nail on the head. Like there's a lot of misinformation out there. Like I jokingly talk about anxiety TikTok. Some of the information that's out there that young people are being exposed to is absolute rubbish. And I think kind of our job, I find increasingly, is to be able to wade through all of that theory and all of that empirical research, and being able to extract the real value, the applied value, and find a way to translate that and apply it to an individual. So like
Mm.
I'm sure that's exactly what you do. And very often I'd say it's the same with your clients. You're maybe not showing them what's under the bonnet always. You're not giving them a history lesson in
No,
CBT. They
correct.
don't
Yeah.
care, but
Mm.
you're presenting them with, okay, I've done that work for you. Here's what should work in your case. This is a technique we can trust.
Mm.
And let's give it a bash.
Yeah, I think that's key. So we talk about information, where people can find out more about the stuff that you teach and your practice. Where can they find you and get in touch with you?
Well, best place if you go to drdyllancolbert.com, and that has information on my services and what I try to do. Across social media, I'm active on LinkedIn, I'm active on Instagram and Facebook, Dr. Dylan Colbert for all of those. Over the past few kind of months, I've been releasing weekly or bi-weekly videos called Sports Psych in 60. I went with that because the alliteration, but it works for kind of any area. And in those videos, I just try to go through some quick, fast acting techniques that you could take on board straight after watching the video. I keep them to 60 seconds. I don't want to
Where are
waste
those
people's
clips?
time.
You get those clips on Instagram, is it, or
Instagram, LinkedIn, and Facebook.
Facebook as well? And I'll grab all those links from you and I'll include them in the notes attached to this episode, so
Brilliant.
people can click on them or whatever. This
Great.
podcast, incidentally, is available on Apple Podcasts. It's on Spotify. It's on Substack, which is where we publish it. It's everywhere good podcasts are played. You'll get this audio. You'll also get it on YouTube. I try to get some clips out on Instagram and what have you. So look out for those. Thanks a million, Dylan, for joining me today. Hopefully we'll do this again soon, because I think that was a
Yeah.
great conversation, and hopefully listeners will get some value from it and begin to apply this stuff. It's been a pleasure talking to you. And thanks very much for your time today.
Thanks a million, Larry. It's good fun.
Good fun. Okay, if you want to get this podcast, it's uh, humanperformance.ie. I nearly forgot my own URL. Is where you'll get everything. So go there. The links are below in the notes as well. and we'll see you next time. Thanks very much, everyone, for joining, and see you soon.